I'm going to start with the idea of place, and clearly both cinema and architecture are located, contextualized in some way, and the way in which they create the conditions of that contextualization is very significant. In other words, how you cite a building or how you cite the framing of a sequence in cinema. So on the left you've got one kind of approach to this idea of place, which comes from Kurosawa, of course, and this is a castle in medieval Japan which during the course of the sequence emerges out of the mist. So it's not seen, and then it's slowly seen, and then it becomes sharper in relief, and then the story begins. And this comes from a Japanese Shinto concept of the mist and of nature as a context for the advance of the world. The world comes forward out of undifferentiated mass, that is the mist, which envelops everything, and becomes manifest to us through that kind of appearance. So there's that sense of an appearance of the world which Kurosawa investigates through cinema. And so that sets up a certain relationship between human beings and the world of the earth and the world of the immortals, which is very particular. It's a sacred concept of a condition of the human being in the world. On the right-hand side you have a scene from Antonioni's The Adventure, L'Avventura, which is set predominantly on an island in Sicily, and the setting for the film is a kind of oblivion, a kind of desert of the earth, but also symbolically or metaphorically a desert of the mind and a desert of culture. And you can see the figures there, the characters of the film, which successively, as the film moves on, become completely lost in this landscape. In other words, the landscape absorbs them, and they become conditioned and tested by the way in which they exist and react to that landscape. And so what you have on the right-hand side is an existential view of the relationship between human beings and the world, quite different from the Kurosawa version, which is more sacred or more sacral. So in that way we can analyze cinema for the way in which cinematographers set up certain relationships between people, place, and we can maybe move across from having seen that into the architectural. How do we think about the world in which we're designing? Do we think of it as having a sacred presence? Do we think of architecture framing an emergence of the world for us? Or do we think of architecture as framing a sense of oblivion, of the desertification of Western culture, of the catastrophe of the environment, of the fact that we are foreigners living on the planet, etc. So on the left you have Murcutt's house on the south coast, I think on the south coast, which has a lot of resonances with the Antonioni approach to nature. Here architecture is set apart from the natural, and the condition of visuality, of survey and of separateness from the natural environment is paramount. The importance of visual relationship to the world and a relationship of survey and control is established. And on the right you have Zumthor's bathhouse in Vals, which looks across the valley to this monumental landscape, Switzerland. What the architect does here, through a very interesting tectonic means of this low awning or slab over the roof of these cellular spaces looking out over the valley, and also the framing of the voids, creating views through, is to in fact bring the landscape into the field of the architecture. So this landscape, which is monumental and looms large when you're there, becomes in a sense domesticated by the architecture. It becomes appropriated by the architecture and brought into this space of the external pool area, so that the architecture frames that landscape and brings it into a kind of neighborhood. Do you see that what's happening here is an exchange between the environment and the architecture, so that architecture extends to encompass the environment. Whereas with Murcutt there is always the boundary. There is always the sense that nature is out there, civilization is in here. I'm simplifying grossly, but I'm just trying to make certain points. Werner Herzog's, I think, fantastic film, but it's been heavily criticised, and for good reason, for many reasons. Where the Green Ants Dream, which is entirely a concoction of Herzog's about an Aboriginal myth which he's trying to tell. He opens the film with very grainy views of tornadoes in America, which has nothing to do with Australia or the Australian Aborigines that are the central focus of the film. And Herzog, if you know his films, has a very particular attitude to the world, which comes essentially from the sublime, the romantic sublime. And so he sees man's condition and existence in the world as both tragic and comedic, comedy and tragedy, in a very kind of arcane Greek sense of human beings kind of lost in a world that is beyond their reach, and in a way being taken to a level of lunacy through that experience. And so he uses a lot of these images which create that sense of the sublime, that is the power of nature which human beings are not capable of enduring, but which they are interminably fascinated by and wish to, in a sense, be absorbed into and disappear into. That's the sublime, and that's very much behind a lot of his films. Now, as the film moves on, we move into Kubapedi and the so-called mythical landscape. This is meant to be a landscape left by the green ants, who in their dreaming dug up the earth and left these little pillars. It's in fact a mining site, an opal mining site. And there's this intense contrast between Western society's tenuous hold on the landscape. He contrasts that with a sort of romanticised view of the Aboriginal condition, that it has a connection to the earth through these stories. And he brings, at one point in the film, he brings the confrontation between the Westerners, who are the miners, and the Aboriginal people represented here by the elders to a head. And in a couple of scenes which are very powerful cinematically and spatially, he sets up these highly charged frames. So here, for example, you have the two elders, the two Aboriginal elders with spears, protecting and framing the environment, which is trying to be penetrated and violated by the miner in the car. So you have the traditional idea of the human being as kind of elegant caretaker of the planet, and you have the miner in his machinic vehicle that is violent and violating, attempting to break through, and they are the guardians of that landscape. Everything about even just a frame like that is full of significance for us. In other words, the kind of static poise of the elders over and against the sort of agitated and angular disposition of Bruce Spence, who here plays the miner. And then the camera turns and jump cut to a view back to the two elders. This time, if you look here, the landscape is obliterated at the edges. In other words, the elders sit hard up against the frame on either side. Here, however, the elders move in a little bit, allowing the landscape to surround them. Okay? So they are both guardians and within the landscape. The spears and disposition of the characters emphasizes a sort of symmetry, but then over and against that you have the asymmetry of the background. At one point, when the miner confronts one of the elders, there's this intense scene where they stare each other down. You have the miner who takes predominance in the frame. He looms much larger and takes up a much larger area of the frame, and he goes right to the edge of the frame. Whereas the Aboriginal elder sits within the frame with sky and landscape behind him. So you have, in a way, the frame of the film is identified with the miner who frames the landscape in a threatening way, and you have the presence and poise of the elder who sits within the landscape in a much more kind of elegant way, and he's identified with that landscape because he fronts onto it. It is behind him. He is a spokesperson for that landscape. So in a way, it's cinema, and the frame of cinema has this violating effect on people and on place. And then you have this intense moment where, because of the darkness of the face and the way in which Herzog has lit the elder's face, and the silence of the scene, there's no soundtrack here, you have this intense moment of the sort of pinhole of the eyes which become almost vacant. And this elevates the elder into a kind of arcane presence that's identified with the ancient, nomadic wisdom, over and against the sort of high-tech, violating, machinic condition of the minor and of their, wish to appropriate the earth. This is where we can begin to engage in a critique of Herzog's approach and his appropriation of indigenous cultures in a particular way to make a point, and his oversimplification of one versus the other, etc., etc. But I'm not so interested in that. I'm just interested in the way things are organized and framed and what they say about our relationship to the world and how that can help us organize the places that we make. So, I'm not going to be explicit about the architectural connections until I get to the architectural examples, but I hope you're starting to see that because I'm talking about these and analysing them, investigating them spatially, that there are direct parallels to the way in which we might, let's say, make a window to a view of a particular landscape. And how we might make that window so that when people are within the space fronting onto the window, they have a particular relationship to the landscape that is beyond them. None of these things are obvious. All of them are up to the control of the designer. And so you, as architects and designers of the built environment, have enormous power in the way in which you can construct certain relationships and push and privilege certain value systems. In L'Avventura, the tourists leave the city and come to this island for a bit of recreation, rest and recreation. There are a bunch of bourgeois who happen to believe that they are in control of their lives, and they encounter this island which becomes a threatening presence and puts them to the test and really pushes the boundaries of that, what they're capable of. The story is essentially the story of a breakdown of a relationship, or of a series of relationships. So Antonioni is using the landscape in all of its kind of elemental and visual and sound power, acoustic power, to parallel what is happening with the characters. Essentially, it's a film about non-communication, or the inability of people to communicate. So it's a very tragic, pessimistic view of human existence. Do you think we can't communicate? What's the use of words? So let's give up before we even start. So you see that people are not able to communicate. And that lack of communication sets them up to experience a world that leaves them, that abandons them. And so they are abandoned on the island in the same way as they are abandoned to the powers that regulate the world. And you recognize very quickly that this is an ancient Greek idea of the existence of human beings entirely dependent and subject to the will of the gods, except that in Antonioni there are no gods. The power of nature is ever present, and in a sense that is the hope in Antonioni's work, that the sublime beauty of nature will supersede us, it will live beyond us, and it's up to us to understand and relate to it in a very particular way. There's a very interesting sequence that I've not seen commented very much in reviews of the film and critiques of the film, but if you haven't seen the film, during the narrative, one of the characters, a central character, disappears and we never see her again. Her friends, her so-called friends, remain on the island looking for her and can't find her, and that's part of their kind of disorientation. But at one moment when they're all asleep on the fatness of their bourgeois existence on the island, lapping up the sun and completely oblivious to what's going on, Antonioni shows a scene where a small motorboat comes away from the island and he follows it as it pans, as the camera pans, and the boat just disappears from left to right on the screen. No one sees it. So the implication is that she has decided to return. Either she's been picked up by someone else, another lover or something, or she's arranged to leave. In any case, she's gone. And there Antonioni uses an interesting trope that you find is used a lot in thrillers and was used a lot by Hitchcock, of showing the audience something that the characters in the film can't see. And so when you know what's going on and the characters in the film don't, you have the setup of a kind of disjunction, an asymmetry of knowledge. And that asymmetry of knowledge is used in cinema to drive the narrative, to drive the thriller, to drive dramatic content. Think about it in architecture. If everything is given to you in total, then there is nothing held back. If everyone knows everything about everything equivalently, then there's no conversation. There's no communication needed. If a whole landscape is presented to you in its totality through architecture, then there's no mystery, you see? So the creation of gaps and disjunctions of knowledge, of information, is actually very critical and central to the driving of a narrative, or to the driving of inquiry, or to the driving of any kind of engagement with the world. So we can learn that from cinema.